Hey, hi, hello. Welcome to Diana Emerson Today. We are listening to Cold Cases Finally Solved in 2022. This is Nancy Marie Benelak. Ugh, Benelak. Okay.
Nancy Marie Benelak.
Here we go.
Nancy Marie Benelak was born in Nevada, California on June 13th, 1942. After spending her childhood in Nevada, she moved to Sacramento and worked as a court reporter. In 1970, 28-year-old Nancy was living alone with her cat on the second story of an apartment complex on Bell Street in Sacramento. While working in Sacramento County Court, Nancy met and fell in love with Ferris Salami. Salami was chief public defender in the Sacramento District Court. They were engaged to be married, with the wedding scheduled for November 28, 1970. Just a month before the wedding, the couple spent their evening having fun before heading back to Nancy's apartment. Nancy quickly fell asleep, so Salami decided to go back to his home. At around 11:30 p.m., Salami left the apartment. Before leaving, he left the sliding glass door ajar so that Nancy's cat could come and go as it pleased in the night, which Nancy often did herself. He never imagined this simple act would put his fiancée in horrible danger. The next morning, on October 26, 1970, when Nancy did not show up for work, her coworkers grew concerned, as she never missed work. One of her coworkers sent her son to check up on Nancy. When no one opened the door, even after repeated knocks, he reached out to the building manager. Together, the building manager and the coworker's son discovered a heinous crime scene after entering the apartment with a passkey. Nancy was lying dead in a pool of her own blood in her bed. She had been ruthlessly stabbed over 30 times. Defensive wounds on her arms indicated that she tried desperately to fight off the attacker. The assault was so savage that her head was nearly decapitated. Authorities were alerted, and they arrived a few minutes later. Blood was everywhere, but no fingerprints were found inside the apartment, indicating that the murderer had probably concealed their fingers to avoid leaving fingerprints. A long blood trail was also discovered, which started from the second-story balcony, continuing to the sidewalk below, and around the apartment complex buildings, which ended in the apartment complex parking lot. Investigators at that time believed that the attacker got into the apartment by climbing up to the balcony, and then attacked and killed her. They surmised that the perpetrator must have gained access to the apartment by climbing up to the balcony and came in through the sliding glass door. They also theorized that this person had gotten injured during the attack, after which they climbed down. Based on the blood trail, the culprit would then have gotten into a vehicle in the complex parking lot and left. Nearly 500 people from the nearby area were questioned, but detectives had no suspects in their sights. Despite the efforts from law enforcement, the case grew cold. Although blood evidence was present there at the crime scene, it was not enough to apprehend the culprit. In the 70s, science was limited to the modern technology of 50 years ago, and only a blood type could be determined from someone's blood, and that's about it. In 2004, a DNA profile was developed from the blood collected from the crime scene and was uploaded to the state and national CODIS databases, but no match was found. Then, after nearly 50 years, in November 2019, detectives from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office re-examined the cold case using forensic genetic genealogy, the same technology that was employed to identify the notorious Golden State Killer. The DNA profile was uploaded to a genealogy website to find possible suspects. Finally, on July 21st, 2022, the murderer of Nancy Marie Benelak was identified as Richard John Davis. Richard John Davis was born on the 22nd of March, 1943. In 1970, 27-year-old Richard Davis lived in the same apartment complex as Nancy. While Nancy lived in apartment number 17, Davis lived in number 23. They were on opposite ends of a pool, and Nancy's apartment could be seen across the pool from Davis's apartment. Among the 500 people, Both Davis and his roommate were interviewed by the sheriff's office during the initial investigation. However, each provided alibis for one another. Davis had no previous convictions except for a driving under the influence charge, so his DNA had never been uploaded to the CODIS database. No motive for the murder has been mentioned, but the murder did appear to be premeditated, according to investigators, due to the killer's choice of placing masking tape over his fingertips, which clearly indicated this was a premeditated attack. Nancy was not close to Davis. The only connection they could find between Davis and Nancy was the apartment complex they both lived in. However, investigators now believe that Davis stalked Nancy and was jealous about her getting married to a decent man weeks later. Apparently, this jealousy and rage are what motivated him to break into her apartment and kill her. The revelation was bittersweet to Nancy's family, as Davis died on November 2nd, 1997, at 54 years of age, due to complications from alcoholism. However, they were relieved to finally know who was responsible for Nancy's death. Stephanie Hebert. On June 30th, 1972, Donald and Joyce Hebert were blessed with a beautiful baby girl. They named their daughter Stephanie Lynn Hebert. The middle-class family lived in a suburban neighborhood along the Mississippi River in Wagaman, Louisiana. In May of 1978, Stephanie graduated from kindergarten at Live Oak Manor Elementary School. Shortly after that, schools were dismissed for summer break. Kids were riding bikes back and forth from their homes to friends' homes, to convenience stores to buy treats, to explore wherever their little feet could pedal to, so long as they were back home when the streetlights came on, as was a common rule in those innocent times. Days before her 6th birthday, on June 13, 1978, Stephanie checked into her house to grab lunch. She had spent the previous night at her friend Lizzie's home. Around 2:30 p.m., after having a bite to eat, she again left her home to go to the house of another friend, Lori, who lived just a few doors away. As it was a safe community, she went alone. This was the last time anybody saw Stephanie. She never made it to her friend's house. Authorities were notified, and they immediately started searching for the little girl with blonde hair, blue eyes, and baby blue-rimmed glasses. More than 100 deputies and 50 volunteers relentlessly searched for Stephanie on foot through the dense woods and swampy areas surrounding the subdivision. Helicopters were also flown over those woods to scan the whole area. They even called for heavy equipment to help give searchers access to areas covered in underbrush and vegetation. Her mother, Joyce, was quoted as saying during the search, "This is hell. I wouldn't wish this on anyone, not even the devil." Initially, it was believed that Stephanie simply walked away and got lost on her own. But when she was not found after 72 hours of extensive searching, it was concluded that there had been a kidnapping. A single lead developed during the search. A local ice cream truck vendor said between 4:30 and 5 p.m. on the same day Stephanie disappeared, he sold 2 sticks of cotton candy to a girl that looked like her, accompanied by a woman wearing heavy makeup. Around 5:30 p.m., an 8-year-old neighbor boy had also seen Stephanie with a woman of similar description about 4 blocks from the Hebert home. However, no such woman could be found even after a thorough search, and the lead fizzled out. As the days passed into months, the chances of getting her back alive were slim. All efforts fell short. Sadly, 5 months later, on the week before Thanksgiving, a hunter made an awful discovery. About 20 miles away from her home, in a remote wooded area of St. Charles Parish, a tiny skeleton was found tied to a willow tree with a rope. Her glasses, shoes, and clothing were scattered nearby, except for her underwear. The remains were identified as 5-year-old Stephanie Hebert. Although an exact cause of death could not be determined, investigators believed she was still alive when she was left there to be eaten by creatures and consumed by the elements. As little Stephanie was laid to rest, investigators could not fathom what kind of monster could be capable of committing this horrendous crime. There were several suspects throughout the years, but none could be prosecuted due to the lack of solid evidence. The case soon turned cold. In 2012, a courageous victim came forward with some truly shocking information about her own sexual assault back in 1979. After the revelation, Daniel Parks emerged as a new suspect in Stephanie's murder. Daniel Parks lived only 8 houses down from where Stephanie lived when she was murdered. He raped a then 7-year-old local girl around the same time as Stephanie's disappearance. This was the same girl who came forward with the information in 2012. The girl was friends with Stephanie and remembered Parks threatening her, saying that she might end up like Stephanie. In the police interrogation, Parks confessed to the rape as well as the comment about Stephanie, but later recanted his confession. He maintained that he had incorrectly implicated himself in the crime due to his condition of diabetes. He was found guilty of 2 counts of aggravated rape and was sentenced to life in prison. He remained the suspect of Stephanie's murder for many years, but was never charged with her murder. Authorities set their sights on another suspect after Jason Franklin Jr., 50, referred to as Jay, came forward in 2012 to reveal the sexual and physical abuse he suffered at his own father's hands. His father, Jason Franklin Sr., was a resident of the same community as Stephanie in 1978. Jay went on to divulge an even more disturbing story from his childhood. He claimed that both of his parents were involved in Stephanie's abduction, and that he, at 6 years old, was not only a witness, but was used as bait to lure the young girl in. Jay told the investigators that his father, Jason Franklin Sr., was a serial predator of young children, and sometimes he was forced to watch and even take part in the abuse. According to Jay, Stephanie was one of those victims. Jay claimed that Jason raped Stephanie on 3 separate occasions before her murder. Jay also revealed that it was Joyce Vinay, his mother, who abducted Stephanie Hebert and brought her to her ex-husband, Jason Franklin Sr. Though the two were divorced, Vinay still loved Jason Franklin Sr. and would often help in his husband's sick activities. On June 13, 1978, Vinay lured Stephanie into their car and drove her to a house in Luling, where Jason was waiting. At some point, Jason put Stephanie into a car and told his former wife to follow. They drove to the swampy area where Stephanie's body would later be found. Jason stripped Stephanie of her clothes and took Polaroid photos while forcing Jay to pose with her. On previous occasions, Stephanie had kept her mouth shut about the abuse, but Vinay argued with Jason about whether this might be a step too far. Stephanie threatened to tell her father this time. Jay recalled her tearful declaration, "I am telling Daddy," a comment that perhaps sealed her fate. Jason witnessed his father straddling Stephanie, tying her to the tree, as they pulled away. He even led investigators to the exact area where Stephanie had been found. When detectives confronted Vinay, she denied involvement and called her son a liar. Despite Jay Franklin's testimony, it still took authorities years to prepare a case due to a lack of physical evidence. They had to determine whether the testimony was admissible and what charges Jason would be eligible for. In 2018, Jason Franklin Sr., 76, was finally arrested and charged with Stephanie's murder. Unfortunately, Joyce has never been charged due to a lack of evidence. Donald and Joyce Hebert lived long enough to see Jason Franklin Sr. arrested. Although they both died in 2020, hopefully they died in peace knowing their daughter's killer had been put away. However, the case was abruptly halted in January 2022 after Jason died of a respiratory illness while in prison. The investigation of this 44-year-old cold case was officially closed after Jay Franklin, the main witness, was killed by an alleged drunk driver in June 2022. For 42 years, Irene Wilkowitz waited to discover the identity of her sister Eve's killer. It was 4 decades of constant fear, not knowing if she too would be the victim of a murder. Eve Wilkowitz was a 20-year-old woman living in Bayshore, New York. She was working as a secretary at a publishing house. She was reported missing after failing to return home from a night out. Her body was found in a yard mere blocks from her apartment. She was kidnapped, raped, and strangled to death after taking a late-night train back from Manhattan. For Eve's sister Irene, the case haunted her for her entire life. She was just 17 years old when police arrived at their family home to deliver the devastating news. Irene never gave up the fight to find who killed her sister. She wasn't famous. She wasn't a celebrity. She was my sister, and she matters, said Irene. Eve was born on April 17, 1959. A Long Island native, Eve grew up in Oakdale, New York. After her mother's passing from cancer in 1977, she soon moved out of the family home and into her own apartment. Here she lived with her roommate, Robert Grogan, for 2 years. Friends described her as vibrant, with a heart as big as her dreams. She was working for a popular publishing house in Manhattan and frequently commuted by train. It took her 2 trips of an hour and 45 minutes each to get to work and return home daily. In 1980, though, Grogan remembered Eve mentioning a feeling of uneasiness. She told him about a couple of men that would follow her from the train station. One man had been pestering her to go out for a date, which she declined. A second followed her for the entire 10-minute walk back to their shared apartment. These pests eventually fell away, and Eve went on to meet a young writer named Jack Dempsey. On March 21, 1980, Jack and Eve spent the evening together in the city. They watched a movie and had dinner before going back to his apartment. Before falling asleep, she asked Jack to wake her up in time to catch the 12:45 a.m. train back to Long Island. The morning of March 22, 1980, Jack walked Eve to the train station. He'd offered to take the train with her, but she waved him off, telling him she'd be fine. He watched her board the Long Island Railroad train. He never saw Eve alive again. By 7 a.m. that morning, her roommate Robert noticed Eve did not return home. He hadn't initially reported anything until the evening, when no one could make contact with her. Together with family and friends, calls were made to local hospitals asking if they'd admitted anyone fitting Eve's description. There was no sighting of Eve anywhere, and panic began to settle in. A woman living just 3 blocks from Eve's apartment made a gruesome discovery in her neighbor's yard on the morning of March 25, 1980. Eve's lifeless body was found on the lawn of another neighbor. She was wearing blue jeans and a blouse. Her shoes and socks were missing. Police were called to the scene and soon discovered rope marks on her wrists, suggesting she'd been bound at some point. Police speculated she may have been held captive and sexually assaulted before being strangled to death and dumped just blocks from her apartment. When Eve's family were informed of her untimely passing, the trauma of her violent end would go on to haunt her sister Irene for the next 42 years. Investigations began, but leads were far and few. Suspects were interviewed and evidence collected, but nothing came from the case, and it went cold. Police even looked into Jack, the last person to see Eve alive. Jack was called out to Long Island. Police were keeping him as a person of interest in the case, seeing as they'd spent the last night together since she went missing. Jack understood the process and cooperated with officials. Fortunately for him, a medical student from whom he'd bought a stereo showed up to deliver the package along with his father. Both men were able to provide an alibi for Jack's whereabouts on Saturday morning. He also had to undergo a lie detector test to prove his innocence. In the 90s, though, 2 detectives showed up at his home and spoke to him before getting a DNA swab as part of evidence for future testing. All the while, the terror of being the next target remained with Irene. She worked as a nanny and shared an apartment with her son. This was in part due to her fear of living alone. For years, Irene became the advocate in finding Eve's killer. Being the only sibling, Irene had no one but her father to turn to when in doubt. Unfortunately, he too passed away in 2010 before knowing who was responsible. Irene kept the memory of Eve alive by giving interviews to local newspapers each year on the anniversary of Eve's murder. She went on to study, work, and marry. She raised 2 children and divorced before moving away from Long Island, living with the fear of being the target of a killer. Her pursuit for justice had her keeping up with detectives every few weeks, following up with leads and being active in the case. Although police were trying, DNA testing had not yet progressed to an advanced stage. Then in 2018, Irene's son told her about the genetic genealogy testing used to identify the Golden State Killer. There was renewed hope. In January 2019, Irene contacted famous genealogist Cece Moore. However, Moore said that she could not get involved, as New York didn't yet allow the technique to be used in a criminal investigation. New York was one of the states hesitant to use the technology, as privacy advocates feared the government's misuse of people's personal data. It was going to be a rigorous process, one that would take months or years. The State Department of Health required a private lab to obtain a permit, which at the time was not being granted in the case. Irene pleaded with Suffolk County Police Lieutenant Kevin Bawer, who was a homicide investigator and oversaw Eve's case, to find a way. Bawer, too, was frustrated by the circumstances, but by December 2019, Suffolk County authorities found a loophole. Since the FBI helped with the original investigation, they were not restricted to New York laws. The semen sample lifted from Eve's body was sent to their labs with permission from the New York Department of Health. Agreeing to this, the FBI began the process of testing, and in July 2021, one of the agents specializing in genetic genealogy told investigators she'd found a distant relative of the unknown suspect, the common surname being Rice. Working with the information they had and several background checks, they found a direct name, Herbert Rice. Herbert, though, had been long dead by the time. He succumbed to cancer in 1991. Looking back into the original investigation, Rice was not considered a suspect, despite a sweeping investigation of the area. He did have a few records of arrests for nonviolent crimes, but none that required he submit a DNA sample. At the time of the murder, Herbert was living with his mother after his then-wife kicked him out of their home. His mother's residence was just 4 houses away from the crime scene. Records showed that Rice's mother was questioned following the murder, but she said she didn't notice anything unusual during the time. Suffolk County Police Detective Jerry Batari had a possible name, and now he needed DNA confirmation before he could break the news to Irene. Detectives tracked down family members of Rice and came upon one of his sons. Failing to obtain a covert sample, Batari just walked up to the son's door and knocked. Hesitant at first, Rice's son eventually allowed Batari and his team to take a DNA swab. Once detectives explained their purpose for the visit, he explained that he had not shared a close relationship with his father. Rice's son and ex-wife filled much of the missing details surrounding the mystery. Although he was not responsible for Eve's murder, Rice's son still wished he could apologize for the actions of his father to the Wilkowitz family. In August 2021, the DNA sample proved that Rice was the killer, as his son's DNA sample provided the missing familial link. Batari, accompanied by other detectives, knocked on the door of Irene Wilkowitz and gave her the news that she'd been long waiting to hear. Irene admitted to expecting the worst, that detectives would tell her that they had hit a dead end. Falling into the arms of her son Evan, whom she'd named in memory of Eve, the nightmare that long haunted her waking hours came to an end. For 42 years, this is all I wanted. I just wanted it to be over. My goal was to be a mom, and beyond that, I didn't allow myself to dream any other dream because I was afraid someone would come along and murder me, she said. They explained to Eve the process of finding Herbert Rice, and after the meeting, Irene said she was open to talking to Rice's son. He too told detectives he would consider the option. Irene thanked all investigators for their outstanding dedication to the case and in solving Eve's murder. I just want to say thank you, said Irene, and how sorry I feel for him and his family to know that a family member is responsible for a crime like this, and they have to live knowing that. It's horrible for them as well. Before announcing the case being solved, investigators obtained a search warrant to exhume Rice's body. The results of testing came back positive on March 23, 2022, nearly 42 days to the date of Eve's kidnapping. Suffolk County Police Commissioner Richard Harrison praised genetic genealogy for the ability to help them find the killer. Bawer praised Irene for her enduring faith in finding Eve's killer. He said she was the real star of the case. In the years that passed, Jack Dempsey wrote on a blog about the feelings that consumed him following Eve's brutal murder. He writes about the impact her death had on his emotions and the periods of heartache. He likens her loss to a cosmic iron wall that he needed to climb to find release. At the end, though, he thanked her for the inspiration she gave him and the guidance she still provides as he makes his way up into the world of writing. In his blog, Dempsey encapsulates the emotions felt by all those who had the privilege of knowing Eve and now feeling the void of her loss. For Irene, though, there will always be unanswered questions. I can't ask him anything. Why did he do it? There are no real answers, no reason why, she said. Irene wants her sister to be remembered not just as a story being retold to the media. She was a real person, and she'd like to be a big sister to me. I want people to know that, she said. Super Bowl Sunday, 1989. While America celebrated the San Francisco 49ers winning over the Cincinnati Bengals, the Rogers family suffered in silence without any word from their beloved sister and daughter, Cynthia. Cynthia Rogers was a 27-year-old biologist working on Parkinson's disease research at the National Institute of Health. She was living alone in an apartment complex in the Forestville area of Prince George County. Her family last heard from her on the morning of January 22nd, 1989. According to her family, she planned on doing some grocery shopping. She'd been on her way to the local store, along the familiar tree-lined path used by locals. Unknown to Cynthia, Eva lurked among the trees, waiting for an opportunity to strike. For 5 days, Cynthia's continued silence fueled her family to begin a search for her that would end in tragedy. Her body was discovered on January 27, 1989, dumped alongside a dirt path strewn with litter in a wooded area of Forestville. Detective Bernie Nelson described the attack as extremely vicious. Cynthia suffered multiple blunt force injuries to her head and upper body. She was sexually assaulted and eventually strangled to death. Described as a free spirit and someone who loved watching birds and taking long walks, Cynthia's death left a void in the lives of her loved ones. For her mother, Rosia Rogers, there was no healing. It's just a big hole, you know, she told Fox 5 during an interview in 2001.
It's just a big old hole, you know.
By then, it had already been 12 years since Cynthia's murder, and investigations had hit a stumbling block. Although DNA evidence collected at the scene was used to rule out possible suspects, the sample was still not strong enough to enter into the FBI database. The profile that the FBI was able to develop from the sample wasn't strong enough to meet the standards entered into the database, but it is something we can work with, given the name of someone we can approach and obtain their DNA and compare it directly to the sample, said Nelson. But there was no name. No suspects ever appeared on the radar in connection to Cynthia's murder. However, on January 24, 2022, the case was revived by investigators, not without the help of Cynthia's cousin, Dawn. She'd been working tirelessly to find new methods of technology that could help detectives solve the case that had haunted their family for far too long. She spent years probing detectives and inquiring about DNA advancements until she finally had her voice heard. I've been making any efforts I could to keep this case in the forefront. It's a glimmer of hope in general that my efforts were not in vain, said Dawn. New technology meant DNA could be retested using newer methods of analysis. Investigators found their suspect, James Clinton Cole, a 64-year-old convict already serving a life sentence. Cole's records painted a picture of a dark criminal past. He was charged with a misdemeanor assault in 1984, a destruction of property charge just days before Cynthia's murder, and a charge of child abuse in 1995. In 2009, the long arm of the law finally caught up to Cole when his DNA matched to a rape investigation back in 1996. The girl had been walking behind Benjamin Stoddard Middle School when she was accosted by the suspect at knife point. He then forced her into the wooded area where he proceeded to rape her. Before fleeing, he tied her hands and feet with scraps of material. She was able to free herself and sought help at a nearby residence. Police questioned the girl, who described her attacker as a medium-complexion black man. He had short hair, was 6 feet tall, and was wearing a black and white striped shirt. The similarities between the crime scenes provided police with an understanding of how Cole planned his attacks. He was an opportunistic criminal. He was arrested and charged for the rape of the 12-year-old girl that occurred on the 20th of August, 1996. He received 2 life sentences, and during his imprisonment, was linked to the murder of Cynthia through advanced DNA testing. He's currently serving a sentence at the Western Correctional Institution in Cumberland, Maryland. Cole was charged with first-degree murder, first-degree rape, and several other offenses against Cynthia. It's unclear when he'll appear in court, but Cynthia's family want to be there when it does happen. For her mother, Rosia, the news has made things lighter. It makes us feel better. In my heart, I feel lighter, she said. But she wants her moment with her daughter's killer. I really want to see this person who did this face to face, says Rosia. For Cynthia's brother, Philip Rogers, the burden has been lifted to a certain point. There will never be a full recovery because of the incident, but we have had some relief, he stated. Investigators do not believe Cynthia and Cole knew each other. They've concluded that Cole may have seen a young, petite woman who proved to be an easy target for his sinister intentions. For 3 decades, the mystery of Nona Stamey Cobb's murder eluded investigators. Nona's body was found along I-77 on the northbound side in Surrey County on July 7, 1992, in the early morning. A female witness who remained anonymous last saw her getting into a truck on the night of July 6, 1992, at the Welcome Center on Interstate 55 in Cleveland County. The truck was being driven by an unidentified white male. Nona was a 29-year-old widow with a 3-year-old son named Josh. She spiraled into drug addiction and 7 months before her murder had lost custody of Josh. Her sister, Vicki S. Gregory, was raising the boy together with her husband. Vicki, though, maintained that Nona was a loving mother who loved her son and family deeply. She loved us, and we loved her. Just because you do something wrong doesn't mean you stop loving her, she said. Nona was found strangled to death by a passing driver on the highway with very little evidence, apart from DNA on her clothing and semen on her body. There were no suspects police could pinpoint at the time. Then, in April 1995, 3 years after Nona's murder, interest was revived following the confession of a known serial killer. Sean Patrick Goebel came forward and confessed to the murders of 3 women. Goebel allegedly targeted sex workers and transported them across states before dumping their bodies along interstates. He confessed to the murders of Brenda K. Hagee, aged 45, Sherry Tu Mansour, aged 34, and Rebecca Haynes, aged 36. His modus operandi seemed to match that of Nona's murder. However, DNA testing cleared Goebel as a suspect in Nona's murder after the semen sample did not match with Goebel's DNA profile. Investigators were back to square one. It wasn't until April 2021 that new technology would help solve the decades-old mystery. The North Carolina State Bureau of Investigation, Surrey County Sheriff's Office, and Identifinders International collaborated to catch a killer. Using the latest method in DNA testing and genetic genealogy, investigators, together with Dr. Colleen Fitzpatrick, president and founders of Identifinders International, identified 71-year-old Warren Luthen Alexander. By using DNA submitted from family members, investigators were able to narrow down the suspect list and identify Alexander through the DNA evidence collected at the crime scene. Alexander was arrested at his home in Diamond Head, Mississippi on March 15, 2022, and held at the Hancock County Jail. He was extradited back to North Carolina on March 27, 2022, and has been jailed without bond. He was charged with the murder and the death of Nona Stamey Cobb. The investigation is ongoing, as many other homicides along the interstate remain unsolved. Police have not directly linked Alexander to other cases as of yet. Sheriff Steve Hyatt gave due credit to the investigators who worked on the case since 1992, stating that the groundwork done by the original investigative team allowed them to find Nona's killer 30 years later through proper evidence preservation. SBI Director Robert Schirmeyer had some strong words for criminals. I want to send a clear message here. Hear my words. The men and women of the SBI, in partnerships with sheriff's offices across the state and around the country, We'll seek out justice for the cold cases that we have in our books. We will work day and night to pursue the suspects who think they may have gotten away with it 20, 30, 40 years ago, he said. I will tell you, genetic genealogy is a game changer, said Schermeyer. When investigators solved Diane Dawn's murder 34 years later, her son Mark Bayer, now 36 years old, was blown away by how the killing was solved. The only evidence ever recorded were fingernail scrapings and a hair from Diane's hands. Diane Lynn Dawn was a 29-year-old mother of one. She was the first female radio repair technician at the San Diego Transit Company. Friends described her as a free spirit with a wicked sense of humor. She loved to draw and was a talented violinist. Diane also had a love for stock car racing and was often down at the El Cajon Speedway watching races. When Diane failed to show up for work on May 2, 1998, co-workers found this behavior out of character. Concern prompted one of them to drop by her Santee apartment to check up on her. What she found was horrifying. Diane's nude body lay in her bed. She'd been stabbed multiple times and bludgeoned to death. Her then 2-year-old son Mark was wandering around the apartment complex unsupervised. Police were called and investigations began, but the leads dried up quickly. Digging into Diane's past, there seemed to be no enemies, no vindictive exes or spouses, no spurned lovers, no motive for life insurance claims. It was not a case of sexual assault or robbery. The killer was a phantom. Despite questioning the maintenance man, there were no new leads and the case grew cold. Mark was adopted and raised by Diane's close friends, but often visited with her family in order to keep the memory of his mother alive. In an interview, Mark Bayer said that although he did have his family, there is a sense of loneliness knowing you've lost your mother. Looking back at some of the struggles that you go through, you kind of feel alone because of what you went through, he said. In the years 2000 and 2001, with technology progressing, investigators tried once more to test the DNA found at the crime scene. Putting it through a federal DNA database from unsolved crimes yielded no results. The sample was not strong enough. In 2010, a cold case team took another crack at the case. This time, they scoured the evidence looking for clues that may have been overlooked. The hair found in Diane's hands was matched to the DNA scrapings taken from underneath her nails. It was a match, proving Diane fought back. The sample was put through CODIS this time. However, no matches were made. This meant Diane's killer didn't commit other serious crimes, or was smooth enough not to be caught. Then in 2020, the cold case team joined forces with the crime lab and utilized the new technology known as genetic genealogy. By tracing genetic profiles of family members to DNA found at unsolved crime scenes, suspects who would have gotten away with crimes were able to be traced. The sheriff's department released a statement with regard to the methods they used to track Diane's killer. They said that it was important to note that genetic genealogy was a last resort in solving homicide cases. Over the years, all avenues had been exhausted. It was most likely the case would have gone unsolved had it not been for the new technology. Using the single strand of hair and samples of DNA scrapings, investigators were able to match the DNA to possible relatives of the genealogy database. It was an exhaustive task, but pure determination brought with it results. Investigators and genealogists poured over 1,300 DNA samples of possible relatives and created 9 family trees before a single common name popped up: Warren Robertson. Robertson was never on the radar as a suspect in the case. He was a local tow truck driver who also lived in the same apartment complex as Diane. He too was known to enjoy stock car racing and did visit the El Cajon Speedway on occasion. However, investigators found no link between the two and could not determine if they'd known each other. Robertson was born in Arkansas, but spent the major part of his life in San Diego. After the murder, he moved to Lakeside, leaving his family behind. He eventually moved to Indiana in 1989. Robert, it seemed, had no criminal past, his most serious offense being the murder of Diane. Unfortunately for the family of Diane, justice was not to be served. Robertson died 21 years prior to the discovery of Diane's murderer. He was killed during a house fire in Indiana in November 1999, aged 39. For Diane's family, getting the answer to the who brought with it a sense of relief. Bayer remains satisfied with the outcome, even though the killer will not see justice served. The answers that my family received is closure, and closure is everything, even after so much time has passed, he said. Bayer went on to say that he heard many good things about his mother from friends and family. She was a good person. Everything I've ever been told and heard about her is that she was a good person, and I like to think that those values have transferred off to me, and I do my best to be a good person. The world could always use more good people, he said. Diane's younger sister, Victoria Dan Minter, said she was grateful to investigators who helped solve the case. I don't think anything was ever going to come of this. I thought I myself was going to go to my grave not knowing, as well as my mother and father, she said. When they came back and said they got a hit, it probably was, other than the birth of my children, the best day of my life. She can now rest in peace. At least there's an answer. But it doesn't make the pain any better, said Victoria. The sheriff's office said in a statement, this murder would likely have gone unsolved if not for the use of investigative genetic genealogy. In January 1999, police responded to calls from a neighbor reporting screaming from a residence in the 1300 block of Carlson Boulevard. The screaming reportedly lasted over 30 seconds before all went silent. At first he tried to go round and check on this neighbor himself, but thought twice and called 911 instead. When police arrived, they found the front door locked. The back door, though, was left ajar. Inside, officers discovered the body of Mikia Wadley on her bedroom floor. She was dead, but her body was still warm to the touch. Her hands were bound with shoelaces, and she'd been raped before being smothered to death. A buck knife was found underneath her body. At just 28 years old, Mikia's young life was snatched away brutally. She left behind an 18-month-old daughter and scores of family members who remember her fondly and never stopped chasing the truth. Her sister, Kelia Wadley, described her as an outgoing person, always smiling and making friends. She had the same group of friends since elementary school, the same group of friends now. Just a sweet person, she said. Mikia's niece, Devine Peterson, said her aunt was someone people always loved having around and hanging around. My favorite auntie. She was beautiful, outgoing, and smart. She loved hanging out and having fun, she said. Police began an intensive investigation. Initially, investigators focused on a man she'd spent time with the previous evening. Other than him, there were no other leads. He, however, was ultimately ruled out as a suspect. The case grew cold as the only person of interest was ruled out. For the next 20 years, though, police continued to follow up on the case by testing the DNA found under Mikia's fingernails and a bloodstain found in the bedroom. In 2002, a mixed DNA profile was created from the swabs collected from Mikia's hands and the bloodstain. The profile was submitted to the Department of Justice to search their offender database. This yielded no results. 18 years later, in 2020, additional DNA testing was done, this time focusing on previously untested fingernail clippings and ligatures. This provided authorities with a male DNA profile. In October of the same year, the DNA profile created by the Contra Costa County Crime Lab was submitted to the DOJ's DNA Databank program. This was done to conduct a familial search of the state's DNA index system. In April 2021, the DOJ's investigation revealed a person who was potentially a first-degree relative of the suspected perpetrator. The relative, though, was ruled out as a suspect. Police, however, had a suspect name, but were keeping the revelation quiet until they could find a confirmed sample. It was going to be difficult because the suspect was already dead. Detectives were able to track down an immediate relative of the suspect in September 2021. A buccal swab was obtained and submitted to the crime lab for testing. That same month, investigators received the confirmation they needed. Mikia's killer was identified as 35-year-old Jerry Lee Henderson. Henderson was someone who was known to Mikia. They shared a mutual friend and often stayed over at the same friend's house. But Henderson had overstayed his welcome. When the mutual friend refused to house Henderson any longer, he instead went to bunk at Mikia's home, not expecting her to return home. Police believe this is when he attacked Mikia and fled the scene after the crime. Whispers abounded and rumors spread with regard to the nature of the crime. Mikia's sister Keila cleared up the confusion surrounding the murder of her sister. Many people labeled the murder as a domestic violence dispute. She refuted the claims, stating that Henderson and her sister were just friends who went to the same college. There had never been a romantic relationship between the two.
So he was a friend of her friend Terry, and they both knew him.
At a press conference on April 21st, 2022, police revealed that the suspect was identified, but had died 11 days after murdering Mikia from an apparent drug overdose. Acting Richmond Police Chief Louis Tirona withheld the name.
So we're 100% confident that he is the murderer. I don't want to give him any honor by mentioning who that might be.
Who wore shirts printed with her photo to show their undying support, to stand up and be heard. Mikia's niece, Devonay, raised her hand to get Tarina's attention. Why is it okay that he's a secret? We know what he did. Why can't the family know? They look at him as a hero. He's not a hero. He's a murderer, she said.
We know what he did. Why the family can't know? They look at him as a hero. He's not a hero. He's a murderer.
Tarina responded by asking her, why give someone fame and notoriety for a murder?
Why give somebody fame and notoriety for committing such a murder?
Attendees at the press conference supported the family's request, demanding that authorities give them the closure they deserved. Bowing to pressure from the crowd, Tarina finally named Henderson as the suspect in Mikia's murder. After the press conference, Mikia's sister, Keila Wadley, spoke to Oxygen.com to iron out a few details. She said the press conference didn't do the story justice, and it felt hurtful and humiliating. She told the news outlet that Mikia actually made it to the hospital, that she herself saw the staff working on her. The identification of Henderson, though, had brought some sense of closure to the family, and their justice was served. Keila stated that Mikia fought back, and that was what ultimately helped investigators find and recover the DNA needed to find Henderson. Mikia would have turned 50 this year, and been a proud grandmother. Her daughter is now a mother herself, said Keila. When given the opportunity to speak at the press conference, Keila simply said that the time of seeking answers for deaths of family members needed to stop. Those communities needed to end the senseless violence. In a statement released by California Attorney General Rob Bonta, he said that it was his sincere hope that this resolution brings the family of Mikia Wadley a measure of peace. Bonta reiterated that no stone will remain unturned to secure justice and find the truth. Nothing can ever bring back a loved one, but we're committed to doing all that we can to help bring the truth to light in the fight for justice, he said.